Okay, yes. You said men now since Me
Yeah,
Too. Yes.
since the Me Too thing,
Hmm.
men are afraid to approach women because if the woman goes and complain that you have, made some inappropriate gesture to her, and there's no way you can control that because in your mind, maybe you were just trying to hold her hand or something like that. And if
Right.
she goes and reports that this was inappropriate, that was an intrusion into her privacy,
Yes.
then you're in jail.
Right.
And
Right.
if you're if you're not in jail, then you're in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of that. I don't know if Rene Girard has said one time, he said, the gods are the Greek gods or something like that, especially the female ones, they were kind of, they would say, they didn't want the men to touch them, don't come too close to them. But
Yeah,
also don't reject them either. If you reject them, then you're punished too, you know? So it's almost like a double bind, you know, like, and I feel like that's kind of what men feel today. If we we are we are told to, like women are saying, well, men don't approach us anymore. Uh, Men don't want to talk to us anymore. Men don't want to
yeah, but
engage
that's
with women.
that's that's because of their doing.
Yeah.
That's not it's not the fault of men,
Yeah.
but now the men, they're afraid because they cannot anticipate. I
Right.
mean, the reaction. Of course, if you meet someone and you talk to her several times and you go out and have a drink or dinner or whatever, and you
Right.
feel and you're very concentrated and appropriate and kind and everything, and
Right.
finally you can sort of just ask her,
Yeah.
would you mind if I held your hand?
Right. Right. Yeah.
Or would
Yeah.
you feel, aggression?
Right. Right. Do you think it's, you know, um, do you think that there's sort of something wrong with, um, you know, the all out culture? I mean, I'm trying to figure out, I mean, we say, okay, yeah, we got it from the Me Too movement and everything, but it sort of seems to me like this was sort of being carried on since probably the what do they call it, the sexual revolution or something like that, where in the West, you know, um, the dynamics between the two genders was changing a lot, you know,
Oh yeah, yeah, sure, sure.
you
And
know.
the problem is that now, of course, the LGBT movement,
Hmm.
encourages men to sort of get married to men and
Hmm.
women to have affairs with women.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they think that this is the right way to approach it, and
Yeah.
because in somewhere in that philosophy of Me Too,
Hmm.
men are systematically labeled as rapers,
Hmm.
violent,
Hmm.
unpredictable,
Hmm.
toxic, and so on and so forth. And
Right.
so women are very, very much afraid. At the
Hmm.
same time, many women, would very much like to, to have a man and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it produces a situation where no one is really at ease. No one is really tranquil. Everybody's trying to sort of evaluate what the others' reaction could be.
Right. They want to anticipate. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Now, what does sort of the, and I know you're retired now, from
yeah, yeah,
psychiatry,
yeah.
but uh, do you know if psychiatry has spoken to this at all? I mean, it just seems to me that like the science of psychiatry or the medical field, has sort of turned more to, just giving people medications,
Yeah,
playing
I
into the
mean,
hands of.
one of my favorite lectures
Mhm.
was to start by telling the students, there's two main things, main problems, main things in psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
One is the diseases like schizophrenia, paranoia, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
acute manic or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
depression, so on. And
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, there is the problems. And the problem could be very severe, could lead to extremely, unpleasant situations, but they're not diseases.
Right.
For instance, if you have a girlfriend and the girlfriend disappears one day with somebody else, obviously you get hurt and
Mm-hmm.
you're not feeling well, and you come to the psychiatrist, you say, I'm depressed, but this is not a depression, it is a problem.
Okay. Okay.
You see? So that you have the diseases,
Mm-hmm.
actually that can really be taken care of mainly by medication,
Mm-hmm.
and the problems that can only be gradually helped by psychotherapy. And
Okay.
psychotherapy, in my opinion, as you probably guess,
Mm-hmm.
is Girardian inspiration. In
Right.
other words, what we need is to try and avoid mimetic rivalry
Mm-hmm.
between two people.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we let mimetic rivalry get into the relationship, it's going to be ruined.
Right.
And
Right.
for instance, one of my favorite sentences would be, when you discuss with the person, or the woman, or your wife, or your friend, and so on,
Mm-hmm.
is to tell them it's not because you're wrong
Mm-hmm.
that I am right.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
see,
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay.
you don't sort of
Yeah.
devaluate the person. You say,
Right.
no, no, it's not because you're wrong
Right.
that I may be right.
Right.
Let's just sit down and discuss it. You
Right.
know,
Right.
it's not a question that we are systematically wrong,
Right. Right.
and
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily right. We have to talk,
Right.
and
Right. You have
then
to dialogue. Yeah.
then. So this is, in other words, always try and get the person involved
Mm-hmm.
into the conversation or into the relationship and so on in a
Mm-hmm.
pacific way. Because if you get into a rivalrous way, somebody's going to, you're going to either, never see the person again, or
Mm-hmm.
somebody's going to get hurt, or somebody is going to get hit,
Right. 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 Right.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. And
And,
those are,
and this is very, very dangerous because
yeah.
nowadays, violence is around the place. Is all over the place.
Right.
You
Right.
in America, and also in Europe, in France, for instance, every single day there is a murder with the knife. You
Wow.
know, or
Wow.
two or three. Every single day somewhere in France.
Wow.
You're walking in the street, or if you're a girl, what happens very often here in France is that those young girls, they go jogging in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
and those rapers, or you know
Mm-hmm.
wait for them behind the tree,
Mm-hmm.
and then you find the girl, in several pieces, all around the place,
Wow. Wow.
and so it's very difficult now because in the past, when I was young,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you could very well tell a woman passing by in the street, "Hey, what a beauty!" She
Yeah.
would turn around and say, "Thank you."
Yeah.
But now she straightly goes to the police,
Right. 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 Right.
and
It's
she
such
says,
a
this guy has been really rude and inappropriate, and he
right.
told me things that I don't know why. So it's a very difficult. It's a complete change
Mm-hmm.
in the relationship between men and women.
Yeah.
And not only that, but it's also between men themselves, because
Mm-hmm.
you have, for instance, several times I see in the United States, a child or a teenager
Mm-hmm.
coming into his own school
Mm-hmm.
and firing and killing his own mates and the
Right.
professor.
Right.
And so and of course, so some very smart politicians say, well, the only way to prevent that is to teach the teacher how
How
to
to use
use a
it.
gun.
Yeah, how to use a fire. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What
But
kind what
you can't transform the school into you know a
yeah,
gunfight at OK Corral.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, as far as men, right? I remember there was another author and he talked about how, when men are young, they run around sort of in packs, like wolves,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something like that, right? But then when they find a girl or a woman that they like, and they attach themselves to, and said they get married and stuff. The man sort of he sort of detaches from the pack, and he starts to become um more dedicated to his wife and to the woman, and then eventually to the children and things like that. So
yeah, yeah. That's a very optimistic perspective. But what
yeah, yeah.
happens? But what happens many times, as I have observed it,
Hmm.
is they get married and everything, and then very quickly they have a mimetic desire converging onto something that you cannot share.
Mm.
And what is it that you cannot share? It's power.
Yes.
You
Okay.
see,
All right now.
power
Yeah.
power cannot be shared, and
Yeah.
so but it's power connected to very small details. Like
Right.
I want to put the white gown today. No, you better put the red one. And so on. Or else, I want to go to the movies. No, I prefer go to the theater or
Right.
to the spa or to whatever. And so it's very very complex. So
Right.
one day, let me tell you a little story.
Okay.
One day, I was in the United States
Hmm.
in a Congress, like 20 years ago, so 30 years ago.
Hmm.
And after my conference, the next day at breakfast, there is a prominent professor comes and says, "Listen, I have a question for you.
Hmm.
I have a daughter. She is absolutely brilliant. She is
Hmm.
a lawyer in New York,
Hmm.
and she is a prominent lawyer.
Hmm.
And her husband is also a prominent lawyer in the same firm.
Mm.
And the
Okay.
problem is that whether it is in the office or when they are at home,
Hmm.
they quarrel all the time. It's perverting their relationship. It's messing
Right.
it up.
Right.
And so he says, "Do you have a solution?"
Hmm.
I said, "Well, this is very complex. It's very difficult, but it's a question of power, sharing power."
Hmm.
So my suggestion, I said, "Listen, it's a joke, but you can try it." I said, "You can form a government. You can ask them to form a government.
Hmm.
In a government, you dispatch various secretaries: the secretary of education, the secretary of finance, the secretary
Hmm.
of this, and you ask them to definitely, distribute those jobs. If the
Okay.
husband is the secretary of finance, then everything financial he takes care of. And
Right.
if the wife is the secretary of, home office, then
Yeah. Yeah.
everything inside the house, she she has the,
Right.
you can't discuss what she decides.
Right.
And then a few weeks later, I was back in Paris,
Hmm.
and this professor calls me up and says, this game amused them, and they decided to use it. And what
Hmm.
happened is that they are now very much in love again. They went to a new honeymoon in
Yeah.
the Caribbean. And I
Okay.
said, "Oh my God, I'm so happy because," and I'm
Yeah.
surprised because I had not distributed the Secretary of Tourism.
That's funny. That's funny. You didn't think it would be that good, huh?
So I mean, this is to tell you that in psychiatry, if you have a Girardian outlook or perspective,
Yeah.
you try to avoid any occasion
Right.
of rivalry to rise.
Right.
And,
Right.
and rivalry can happen over anything.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
I want to go. I want the child to have to play football. No, he better play basketball. You know,
Right.
it's
Right.
things like that. I mean,
Right.
that are really not important.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's not a question of deciding whether we're going to have a war or something.
Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. That's that's I think that's an important thing to look at. And I wanna maybe bring in the whole thing of, since we're talking about, the mimetic rivalry and everything. I want to try to maybe include, the Bible verse where Paul talks about marriage, and he talks about, how the man is supposed to, love and sacrifice, have a sacrificial love like Christ, and how the woman is supposed to submit to her husband, and that's a very
Yeah,
controversial
well, I
thing
mean,
to
I
say.
tell you, today, if Paul was to take, to come and talk in public, he would
Yeah.
be he would be he would be lynched. He would be accused to be sort of anti-feministic,
Right.
anti-LGBT, whatever.
Right.
Now,
Right.
no, but listen, what is interesting, and I'm working on this maybe for my future, my next book, if I have enough life to live to write it,
Okay.
is to start with the Bible in the first chapter of Genesis.
Hmm. Hmm.
God creates man to his resemblance.
Yes. Okay.
So, in other words, creation is mimetic.
Yes. Okay.
You know,
Okay. Yes.
creation is a mimetic process.
Yeah.
God projects his image
Hmm.
onto the soil,
Right.
and
Okay.
man comes up. And what he gives man, he doesn't give him, he doesn't make him a god, but
Hmm.
he gives him things that the other animals do not have,
Hmm.
which is language, intelligence. He's able to talk and so on. And
Yes.
very soon, in the next chapter, in the next paragraph, God realizes that if this creature is has to obey and function by the mimetic psychology,
Hmm.
he needs somebody else because he doesn't exist by his own on his own. So he
Okay.
creates the woman,
Yes. Okay.
and he creates the woman by cutting half of his breast. In
Yes.
other words, to show that they have to be united. They
Right.
have to. They are
Right.
all one and the same,
Hmm.
but they can sort of share. Unfortunately, Eve is then tempted by curiosity.
Hmm.
Why is this tree forbidden?
Yes.
And her conclusion is, if everything is allowed,
Hmm.
but this tree is forbidden, it means that God has, a very great importance in that tree, and
Hmm.
therefore, if we eat that tree, we will become like God.
Okay.
We will acquire the final, the final privilege.
Right.
We will be like gods. And of
Right.
course, in my opinion, the guy who wrote the Bible
Hmm.
creates the person of the snake
Okay.
to explain the situation. But in my opinion, the snake is just an allegory. It's just an image for mimetic rivalry.
Wow. Okay.
You
Wow.
see,
Wow.
the
Okay.
snake is just an image to
Yeah.
represent mimetic rivalry. And
Okay.
of course, the next chapter is
Hmm.
Cain and Abel.
Right.
And in Cain and Abel, you see that God accepts the gift from Abel,
Hmm.
but refuses the one from Cain.
Right.
And then he addresses Cain. Forget, there's no more snake.
Yeah.
He addresses Cain in psychological terms. He
Yeah.
says, "Why are you mad?
Yeah.
You can be good, and next time you can also improve your gift, and it will be accepted.
Yeah.
And Cain is so overwhelmed
Yeah.
by mimetic rivalry
Yeah.
that he goes and kills Abel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in the mythology, in the
Uh-huh.
Greek mythology, Eteocles and Polynice, the two
Uh-huh.
sons of Oedipus,
Uh-huh.
Oedipus,
Uh-huh.
they kill each other
Okay.
because of
Okay.
mimetic rivalry.
Yeah.
And then Romulus and Remus, who were founding Rome,
Yep.
Romulus kills Remus
Right.
for stupid reasons,
Right.
mimetic rivalry.
Right.
He wants to be the only creator of Rome.
Yes.
So in other
Yes.
words, you can follow in religion, in and in religious writings, and in philosophical writings, and in literary writings, you
Hmm.
could follow the path of the mimetic rivalry everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, mimetic rivalry has been labeled as snake, as devil,
Hmm.
as demon,
Hmm.
as anything.
A
They,
scandal,
yeah,
scandalon. Yeah.
yeah. We everybody, men and women have tried to label
Hmm.
this and make it an exterior
Hmm.
factor instead of admitting that it is there. You
Right.
know,
Right.
and
Right.
so when Christ on the cross
Hmm.
says, "God, my Father, please forgive them because they don't know what the hell they're doing,"
Hmm.
and I add, yes, not only they don't know, but they don't want to know.
Mm. Yeah.
They don't want to know because they keep denying
Right.
that they are completely submitted to mimetic desire.
Right.
You
Right.
see?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
They want to stay in that then.
yeah,
Yeah.
they want to accuse, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and so it's very interesting because then you realize that everything in history, in literature, in religion, everything
Hmm.
is absolutely functioning by the laws of mimetic psychology,
Yeah.
and the great danger is to take the model and make it a rival.